is the wet season, but yet a scorching heat wave affected Barbados in September, and currently, residents in rural parishes are being plagued with water outages. This is because Barbados and other Caribbean islands are currently experiencing a major drought. In this episode of College Insider, we will look at the impact of the drought and its implications on food security. With the discussion on the drought across the country, our first thought was at the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, based here in Barbados, to get a better understanding on what exactly is a drought and how it affects the region. We got a chance to speak with some of the experts in the weather-related field. Chief of Applied Meteorology and Climatology, Adrian Trotman, and climatologist Dr. Cedric Van Merbeck. So first, what is a drought?
Drought is about rainfall that's less than you would expect it to be. So what would you expect it to be? If you look through the years, okay, you know this might be on average. Let's use certain basic terms. Average a certain amount of rainfall, but for me, normal is obviously in a range. Sometimes you don't ever get average, right? But it's something around there, right? Let's put it basically. So once you have a deficit of that rainfall, if there's less than that normal, it could extend into a period where you start to see then a decline in your available water levels. And by available water levels, I'm not talking about necessarily in your tap, all right? Especially in the case of Barbados, most of our water comes from below the ground. So when you think duration, one of the first thing that shows sign of lack of water is a plant, right? So essentially, crops. So agricultural production essentially.
This isn't the first time the region has been affected by a drought, and by all indications, it will not be the last. Mr. Trotman says this is because of the El Nino phenomenon.
Let me put it this way. Most of the droughts we experienced in the past were associated with El Nino Southern Oscillation, the El Nino phenomenon, right? So we did have an El Nino that started in late 2018 into 2019. And we are now feeling some of the effects of that, even though the El Nino has actually dissipated, right? Because drought is accumulative, right? It ain't like you could get a flood from one rain. You don't get a drought in one day. It takes a long time. The accumulation of the lack of water, the deficit in rainfall accumulates till you start to see it impacting something.
Now, many have been asking whether the frequent droughts are related to climate change. Let's hear what the climatologist has to say.
Just let it be clear, right, that droughts have always been a part of our climate, with or without climate change, right? So the question here is though, are they getting stronger? Are they getting more frequent? Those are the type of questions that are being asked. When we talk about the wide scale droughts as related to El Nino, for example, when the forecasting is easier. So the question many people ask are we getting more frequent episodes of El Nino, or are they getting stronger? So these are the questions being asked. Or maybe will they become more frequent and stronger? But certainly the projections suggest that as we approach the middle and into the latter part of the century, that with a decline in rainfall, right, that droughts in the Caribbean will become more and more concerned.
While noting that the droughts are not particularly related to climate change, the climatologist says the heat wave we are currently experiencing is.
There are some ways in which we can define heat that is excessive. Excessive heat means it really impacts us. And as you know, heat has been the talk of the day for quite a few days in September, and also still a little bit now. Why is that? Because September is the hottest month on average. But this year was a bit hotter than usual. And so if it's hotter than usual, you tend to see those extra bits of heat that we can hardly cope with. There's definitely a climate change signal in that. Yes, it has become hotter, and September already being the hottest month, we see that September is getting harder on average throughout long periods of time. It's getting harder to cope with. So heat is something that has been a little bit more prevalent this year than the past 2 years. So in 2017 and 2018, September was okay. I mean, yes, it did feel hot, but not excessively hot. This year it was really bad.
He also says that if we are to feel some relief from this drought, it needs to rain a lot.
It's not just because it rains that we get our recharge of our reservoirs. We need the intensity of the rainfall to be high enough. So if you have 10 days that are wet, but on those 10 wet days, which you might see or which you might think, okay, we're getting plenty of rainfall, but if you still get just half of what you have in other years on wet days, you still end up with the deficit, right? So even though we see some heavy showers, etc., if those heavy showers are less intense, or if they last a bit shorter than they do in other years, or if they're less frequent than in other years, for that time of year, for October, which is our wettest month, well, you still have a deficit, right?
There are several stages to measure a drought for a country: drought watch, drought warning, and drought emergency. This graph shows predictions of the drought conditions for the end of November. CIMA says the countries highlighted in yellow are the ones that should be considered under a drought watch. Orange are the countries under a drought warning. And here is Barbados. There's only one country under a drought emergency: Belize. As I said before, the drought has had a severe impact on the region, especially Barbados, resulting in low water supplies. Several rural parishes have faced the brunt of this drought: St. Joseph, St. John, St. Thomas, St. Andrew, St. George, and St. James. This represents 55% of the island's parishes which are affected. This has caused the Barbados Water Authority to introduce a number of water conservation plans, including a prohibition notice, water rationing, and building 2 new pumping stations.
We're trying to get in to the Castle Grant system as it's being pumped along to try to get it to service that system, to get it into that system. It is being pulled off from all the districts that are along that line. So what then happens is when we have scarce water or low pressure, nothing at all is actually getting to the Castle Grant system. So the reservoir just starts to drop because it's not being replenished. So we are now at the point where we have to do what is necessary in order to get the water into those areas. So people who might have been accustomed to getting a constant supply of water are now going to start to experience some scheduled shutoffs.
Daunting words for many Barbadians. However, it isn't all bad news. The BWA has considered offering discounts for those residents who have been affected.
The issue of considering discounting or even rebates, these are things that have always been tabled. They've been tabled in the past, they've been looked at in the past, they're still being looked at as we go forward. But what the Barbados Water Authority has been constrained to do is to make sure, in terms of delivering on its mandate, we at least, if we can't supply the pipe one, we try to supply it in one way or another.
One of the country's most valuable resources is under threat by low water supply and extreme heat: food. Now, we hear from the Chief Executive Officer of the Barbados Agricultural Society, Mr. James Paul, on why it's very important for farmers to practice water conservation.
Well, certainly the drought does have a period where you're undergoing stresses, all right? So all of that could also impact on the availability of milk later on, because in order to have milk, you must be able at the same time to produce a calf. So if you can't get the animal bred, you will have a problem later on in terms of your milk production. The operations that require large amounts of water to be constantly fed to the birds, you cannot have them being dehydrated. If not, that will produce its own problems. In addition to that, we also find, even in terms of the processing operations, when it relates to even pigs and birds too at the same time. A large amount of water is required for processing operations because we cannot use anything other than potable water. And where, for instance, the Barbados Water Authority supply becomes compromised, you will have a problem for those operations. So we cannot underestimate the impact of drought on, first of all, processing operations, because they need water in order to make sure that they maintain a certain amount of cleanliness, hygiene standards, because the truth is that really now in most processing operations, you have a particular ratio of water that must be given to, in terms of processing the bird. You must maintain a certain amount of water. Built into the government incentive program, there is some incentives for farmers to actually engage in water harvesting, but the issue is that the ability to use that water harvested, you cannot use it as drinking water for animals. Very clear. There might be one exception, I think, in the case of cows, but certainly not in the case of pigs and certain other farms. But so at the end of the day, you still have to rely on a clean water supply from the Barbados Water Authority. So while you can have water harvesting, the use of the water is limited to certain uses, which might be mostly, for instance, for washing down of pens and keeping them sanitary and things like that.
So you may ask, which crops and livestock are mostly affected by this drought?
A lot of, for instance, lettuce is a crop. If you do not have, for instance, good irrigation throughout, because it uses a lot of water, those could be impacted. Things like cucumbers, because they use water, especially in those short crops that demand water over a short period of time, they will be impacted. There are some crops like sweet potatoes, once they get established, okay, they will keep going for you. Yams, once they get established, they will keep going for you. But generally, short crops, you could have a great problem in terms of getting them established because they need water at the early stages of growth. If they don't get that water, then you have a big problem.
As Barbadians continue to endure the impacts of the drought conditions, it is important for all of us to practice water conservation. Thank you for joining us. This has been another episode of College Insider.